Let me acknowledge the Noongar people and their leaders present and those that went before, and acknowledge that we are on their country, and a country that has never been ceded to any sovereign, the Crown of Western Australia or the Commonwealth Crown. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. I have no idea what I'm supposed to talk about. That's not entirely true. It's a bit like question time. You walk in and someone gives you a bit of paper and you've got 3 questions to ask someone about a subject you have no idea about. But I do have some idea what this is about. And I'd be misleading you if I didn't appreciate the work that you do as unionists and the essential role that you have in a civil society, and particularly in this society of Western Australia, but also in the national society that seems to be cartwheeling out into a more and more conservative, dictatorial and uncaring environment. So I appreciate the work that all unions do, and I admire the efforts that the rank and file go to achieve not only better conditions for members and for the workplace in which you find yourselves and your members find yourselves, but more so for the transformation of the civil society, which is a harder thing to do today than it was probably previously, to actually be about community development issues and values and principles. I remember when the Gurindji were on strike in the Northern Territory, and the hard yards that went in by some of the unions then to assist Vincent and others to travel to get to some of the town halls to at least inform people about the living conditions, the life under Vesti and the treatment of people, women especially, and the living conditions, and how much that was appreciated. The unions that help people stay at Dagaragu, but also help people get around to get their messages through and set up press conferences and set up meetings in town halls across Australia. So I was a young man at the time, and I observed some of these things, not knowing fully what they were all about, of course, except for an occasion outside the Katherine Town Hall where I was growing up. And there was a meeting called the Whites for Rights. It doesn't get much mention in Australian history, but it was billed as the Rights for Whites, and I was a young lad, I think I'd just come out of, hadn't finished secondary school, I was in Form 2. But because I was the most seemingly educated of all our mob, people outside were all looking in through the windows, and they said, well, you better go in and explain to them why they're so wrong about the Gurindji people and their cause. So, being such a valiant-hearted man, I said, no, I'll leave that for another day. But the racism, ignorance, hatred and hostility against First Nations peoples has been part of the course of most things that I've ever been involved in. Not always that as an exclusive experience of our society, because I've met many wonderful non-Aboriginal people, many wonderful people who've stood up for Aboriginal people in different ways and in different sort of theatres of life. And the one I often tell is about a lady who, Mrs. Gartland, who was the wife of a Western District's farmer. And I used to spend most of my holidays there when I was going to secondary school in Victoria at Hamilton. And the welfare were very much in control of our lives in those days because my parents had died. And they sent a letter up wanting to know whether the family to which I went for my holidays, because I couldn't go back to the Northern Territory, whether they had sheets on the bed that I was sleeping on. Now that might have been a nice paternalistic thing to do, but it wasn't the right thing to do to an ex-matron of the Western District's hospital. And so Mrs. Gartland said, let me know when the welfare man comes next to the college. And so I did. And they had about 20 minutes with him and I never saw him again. So the power of people standing up for principle, for good, and for the right things is such a wonderful thing. It inspires, and has inspired me in many of the things that I've tried to do in my life. And sometimes I've never stood up properly when I could have done. And I recall an occasion when I was the chair of the Reconciliation Council in Melbourne, and we had this big dinner, big fanfare, and this young Aboriginal boy had come down from New South Wales somewhere. He was dressed in his school uniform, had someone with him, but we couldn't get him into the dinner because of the regulations and the rules that said only a certain number of people could occupy this space, otherwise the fire brigade were going to throw us all out or something was going to happen. So I begged the staff to find a way to get him in, and I felt very much a failure in not achieving that. But when I went away, they told me later they did get him in, and he stood around the side of the hall. But a marvellous thing for people to pick up and try and overcome what was ostensibly an objective problem of rules and regulations, and said this had capacity for X number of people, and if we went over that, then liabilities and all sorts of other things would befall us. But I felt very much enabled, despite the fact that I was the chair of the Reconciliation Council at the time, and we just had that awful episode with Howard thumping the table on extinguishment for native title after his victory speeches up at Longreach, saying there'd be bucket loads of extinguishment in native title. So the experience with human beings is a very important part of what might motivate us to do things, and they don't have to be big things. They don't have to always be in the front page or the front line of the movement. We just have to be part of the team, to be there, supportive, acquiring knowledge, understanding the objective and the vision, particularly the vision of where we want to get to. Because if we can latch onto the vision, we may never achieve it for a long time. But if we have got a clear vision and we seek to walk towards it, trying to build up friendship and allies as we go towards that, then we'll overcome anything. We'll overcome anything. And I've seen that on so many occasions when First Nations peoples have had to muster, and with the support of the unions again, and some of the religious groups and people of goodwill, march down the streets, march into the police about a cause, either for land rights, better living conditions, for housing, for education opportunities, for employment opportunities, for access to the public service, for infringements or things that have happened where people have died in custody or been held inappropriately in prisons or in detention centres. So I've often thought about the Western Australian situation in the 1905 Act, which really sets the foundation of race relations in this state, and how draconian that really was, and how much that perpetrated or influenced the policies towards First Nations people, and the dominance, obviously, of the protector, the native protector, whether it's Neville or someone else, and the intrusion, therefore, that they could make into the lives of people, not only just removing kids, but in insisting certain levels of behaviours outside of the institutions. The institutions were bad enough, but outside of those institutions, influencing the police and influencing the teachers, and basically upholding an ideology about assimilation that was detrimental to the well-being of First Nations peoples. And gradually we've been trying to peel that back and push it back, and we've made some gains in that area, but we're yet to achieve that. And you've seen the recent debates over the recognition in the Constitution, the need for a voice to the Parliament, a need for a Makarrata Commission, about truth-telling and about treaty making. It's a long road, and we've gone up and down on it. I chaired a couple of committees outside of the Parliament with the expert panel. We made recommendations, in particular to section 5126, the race power, because that power is embedded in a racist thought. The racist thought was primarily about people of colour, people to the north, the Indians, people, the Chinese and others, because Aborigines were deemed to be dying out, so it wasn't deemed necessary to recognise us in the Constitution in 1901. But to ensure that we weren't going to die out, because there was an each way bet on this, there was another section in the Constitution that said we shouldn't be counted in the reckoning of the numbers of the pollies that ought to go to Canberra. And so the states kept control and limited the capacity of the federal parliament to actually have any real capacity to administer funds or to adopt policies that might have been more enlightened. Until 67, of course, when there was a change. And some of you, no doubt, were part of the 67 referendum push and the education push, which was to change section 5126. But it leaves the racist thinking still there in that section, as we saw with the Hindmarsh Bridge decision, which was a decision that the Parliament agreed could be made in an adverse manner to the interest of the Aboriginal people. So at every time you climb up a wall, and no doubt many of you are concerned with safety and the well-being of your comrades and your friends, you check the safety business, you make sure you can take the next step, and then you take the next step and you realise that someone else is up there with a hammer and hitting you across the nails to push you back down. And that's how it feels sometimes in Aboriginal politics. And it really wasn't until I became a formal member of the Labor Party, which wasn't that long ago, I might say. So I stayed out of party politics because of my involvement with First Nations politics and not wanting to appear to be partisan towards one or other of the parties. That never worked, of course, because I got ballot up by Richardson and I got ballot up by the Libs, and so you never got anywhere, except if you wanted to sell your soul, in part, to one or other of the parties. So it was only when Bill Shorten was the leader and Senator Bullock decided to retire that I got the opportunity through Bill to fill the vacancy and the support of the unions movements, and I thank you for that. And then, of course, we had the double dissolution. I was there for a week and got sent out to go and earn me bread and butter, and that was the longest double D in Christendom. Got elected at that, and we were hopeful we may have made government, which I think would have been a great thing for this nation. We didn't, and I apologise about that, but we're going through the anxieties of how the hell we lost that. But it was a good. I don't think anyone got over confident or cocky about it. I just think we didn't sell the message clearly enough to the punters who felt that they're going to get a better deal from the other mob, particularly when it comes to the hip pocket, and they didn't understand why we needed to have a broader tax base than what ScoMo and the others were putting forward. So politics has its, and I haven't been there that long, about 5 years now, I think. But I see, and I've learned from some of our champions that have been primarily in the Senate, is where I live most of the time, except if I'm on a joint House committee, which I have been on with Julie and Lisa when we looked at the recognition question, and with Warren Snowden and Warren Inch at a Northern Development Committee, which looks at development north of the 26th parallel and then links into the NAIF funding. Currently I'm involved with what's called the Human Rights Commission, which is a new experience for me, because it deals with every bill that comes to the Parliament to see whether it conforms with one or other of the 8 covenances or treaties that Australia's entered into, and the 28 or 29 rights that emanate from one or other of those covenances or treaties. So that's they give you all the bills, and the advice 5 days before the committee meets, and then you're meant to come along and be non-partisan when you reflect on some of the draconian things that we see go through the Parliament. Our job is to make sure there's at least conformity and compliance to the bills as best we can, and then they obviously go back to the parties for their own considerations. The other committee that I spent a bit of time with is we had a bit of a look at multiculturalism, which I think is a really important part of our fabric of our civil society today, and we don't really celebrate it enough. I think it has to be, it's got to be something that I know leads to tensions. Otherwise you wouldn't have got Senator Anning and you wouldn't have got half of those crazies from Pauline Hanson's crew in there. But in reality, we are a multicultural nation, and we've got to celebrate, and we've got to get more people into the Parliament to break down this what I call the Merino concept, you know, the old establishment that believed that they have a right to rule and lord it over the rest of us. So there's and we need to get more women. Labor Party at least has got a lot of women, and very good women in our party. I mean, my boss is Penny Wong, and the whips are women. They've used it on me once for being late. But generally the spirit amongst the political arm is good. It's good. I do worry sometimes, and I wasn't at our state conference the other day, and I'm saddened by some of the things that I see. But I do think we've got to think Labor. You know, a really big thing. I know we compartmentalise our problems because we're locked into that, but we've got to get broad-shouldered about what's the objective and who is the enemy. Who is the real enemy in this process? And I can tell you, it's a bloke who sees miracles. It's not necessarily our leader. It's that fellow that reckons he sees miracles, or he believes in miracles. But that's not for the poor, nor is it for the workers. So whatever miracles he's seeing is different to the ones we see. They're more like nightmares. So the role of First Nations, I think with a few of us, with Linda Burney, who's now our Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Melinderi McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, of course, from the Northern Territory, and myself, we've been able to create within the political party framework things that we would have taken for granted, like recognition of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra as part of our opening of our caucus. We've established that happens. We have the flags flying of the Aboriginal, Torres and Islander peoples, and we have set up a First Nations caucus committee, which is a critical part of the machinery of politics, so that matters that are going to affect First Nations come to our committee. Shadow ministers are meant to brief us about any legislation that is likely to affect us, whether it's native title or it's social welfare or some other darn thing. And we have a role to comment on it. It's not just the three of us, because we have other comrades and colleagues from other electorates with large First Nations populations. And that's good that we do get a very good cross-section of the party that comes along. And we try to assist the caucus, basically, at the end of the day, on an enlightened approach to the way we go about our policies. And the hard work that was put in previously for our platform by Linda and the Reconciliation Action Plan and the policy positions we adopted and the platform we adopted was very much due to that hard work coming out of that First Nations caucus. And the support we got from all the colleagues around the country was fantastic. I recently, just ring the bell and I've got to stop with it. I recently went on a trip with some of my colleagues from the Eastern Seaboard, with Linda Burney, with Warren Snowden, and with Murray Watt, who's our Shadow Minister for Northern Development. And I took them down from Port Hedland down through the back way, the Inland Road, to Nullagine, Marble Bar and Leonora, Laverton and all of those places. Basically then ending up back at Uluru through Warburton and Dogger River. In order for some of the comrades to understand how big this state is, and that's only a part of it, as you know, It's only a part of it, but it's a very important part of it. It's a very unique part of Australia for many, many reasons. And if you haven't read a book called Dystopia, you should try and get hold of it and read it, because it's about the failure of governance in this region for many different reasons. And it baffles me. It really does baffle me, but it's an area which is dear to my heart. But anyway, I took them through there to expose them to, just to meet the people. Meet the people. We didn't have a lot of time in most places. In fact, it rained, I think, for the first time in Kew or Meekatharra or somewhere. They blamed us for bringing the rain. But it was a wonderful trip, a lot of dust. Every place you went, people were very happy to see us. Now, that's what the Labor Party's got to get back to. We've got to get our members on the day-to-day things that are affecting people's lives. You know, it galls me, and I was talking to one of the comrades here before, it galls me to see the government get up and say how they're the friend of the worker and how they're doing this for tradespeople, or how they're doing this for TAFE, or you know, they've pinched all the things that the Labor and the union movement have fought for over the years. They talk about being in remote Australia. I don't think any of them have been on that trip. But when did Michaela ever go out there and get her hair washed? You know? So, you know, I'm sure Julie Bishop never went out there either. You know, you wouldn't have got any water. They wouldn't have had enough water to wash their hair. But no, I'm sure she doesn't. But we're at we've got a 3-year period. It's going to be hard. I know Ken White very well. He had a tough time previously before this election. Now he's the minister. He's going to have a tougher time now that he's minister, because there's high expectations on him. But he doesn't have the ground root support in his party, unfortunately. And that's going to make it even harder for him. And the last thing you want is to see a man like him be brought down because of the bastardry of the Liberal National Party. And that's something that we're very conscious of. We try to work with him as much as we can. But we are committed to what the Uluru Statement talks about, and we are committed to seeing the entrenchment of the voice in the Constitution. Now, there are reasons that we could have a whole discussion about all of that if you wanted to, and I have my own views, personal views about that, and its strengths or weaknesses. But that's what people have asked for, and that's what we've been trying to achieve. The real crunch of the process of reconciliation is really when we get to treaty making, and we've got to get to that position. Now, as workers and people responsible for workers, you're concerned with improving conditions and workplaces and quality of life factors for membership, and that's good. We've got to try to link all of that into the quality of life and the integrity of the nation from a historical perspective, from the dispossession of the First Nations peoples and the restitution of that by way of justice. And that comes to not just compensation issues or comes to governance issues. It does come to the position of the First Nations before the Parliament of this nation. There's never been a ceding of sovereignty in relation to that. So there's got to be a debate, a discussion, a negotiation around the question of how can the nation come to terms with the non-ceded sovereign position of the First Nations. And it's not a big deal. It should not be a big deal. And we shouldn't be afraid of it. And that's why the truth-telling is critical. Truth-telling, and I'll just say a little bit on that, because a few months ago I had the privilege of going to the South Coast, South Australia, Whyalla, around that part of the world. I've never been there. Little place called Elliston, I think it's called. Those South Australians who know it, Elliston. Now, a massacre had occurred there, but it didn't come to light. Well, it'd been sitting, like a lot of these things, sitting in the subconscious, in the unspoken record, or in the whispering and the mutterings of people who know about these things in these locations. But it only came to light when there'd been a huge storm that smashed the walking trail and the tourist infrastructure of the little town, which is built along the coastline. And they discovered in their research some records from the Victorian Supreme Court that talked about a prosecution of settlers who'd driven Aboriginal people over the cliff into the Southern Ocean. And people knew about this, of course, and this is where people like John Cock and Eddie Betts and some of these people's ancestors all came from, and maybe others. But they did nothing about it until the mayor, to his credit, a white guy, so we can't ignore this anymore. Here we are, we're confronted with a Victorian state court record. It's not whether it did or didn't happen. This is at least let's believe in one of our institutions in this country, the Victorian Supreme Court. And so they had to take that on board. And to their credit, they developed these huge black marble monuments with an Aboriginal man and one with an Aboriginal woman and a little baby. And they put it on this point where there's people who have been driven over. And they had a group of young kids from Port Augusta come down, and for the first time since that event, these kids danced on that very spot. So you can imagine the transformation in the attitudes and the feelings of everyone. There wasn't a dry eye amongst black and white people that day. And in fact, it built up the bonds because it was a releasing of so much of the guilt that someone felt or the hatred that someone else felt. And a very small thing, but a testimony to what was the history of that part of the world, at least. So these things are possible to be done in an incremental way. There are big things that need to be done, and we had on our platform, and I'm glad that the Libs have still got it there. We've got to get Ken to deliver on it, and that's a national keeping place in Canberra within the Parliamentary Triangle for the unknown warriors, for Aboriginal peoples whose human remains we don't know where to put them back to or where to go with those, but to repatriate them to this place and make it respectful, something like the War Memorial, and have a listing of all the various encounters and wars that went on around Australia, so that when we celebrate nationally, we start to celebrate also the unknown warriors, the unknown Aboriginal warriors who stood in defence of their lands but were either shot down or poisoned or did something else. So we develop a respectful place. Hopefully if Ken can deliver on that within this Parliament, that would be a grand thing. And it may be something we can all work together with, putting some pressure on to get that done. Because as you know, ScoMo's allocated $50 million to a Captain Cook monument in his electorate, okay? So if he gives $50 million to this, that'll be a grand thing. So this contrast is, as I say, every time you try to get somewhere, someone whacks you on the hand with a hammer. I don't know what it is about the blindness of it, but Kath Walker used to call this thing sort of mental constipation, where people just couldn't see the harm by their unenlightened approaches to what could have been a liberating consequence for all of us. So I think that's what we need to aim at. My last little story is, as a kid, I grew up in Catherine. I was born in Broome, and I grew up in Catherine. And as I mentioned a bit later, there was that Rights for Whites meeting when I was a young boy, still at secondary school. But as I grew up in Catherine, I remember seeing old Aboriginal people, going to work at the houses of the white folks, and it was just a status quo. There was no whips or dogs or horses, running around. People would come out of the scrub with yokes, with 4-gallon drums, and they'd go to work at these people's properties, ironing their clothes or chipping away with a little axe, cutting the grass, doing the washing and all of those things. And then in the evening, they'd go back, carry their water back to the fringe of the town into the scrub and do the same thing day in and day out. And I thought to myself, well, that's something unjust about that. There's something really wrong about elderly people. These are elderly people. They weren't young, fit young people. Elderly people having to do that. And then I went with a group of men out to a little property out of Catherine called Willaroo Station. And we had to bring cattle in to Catherine. And I was a very young boy. and I was amongst all these Aboriginal men, about 6 of them, and we had a herd of about 600 cattle. And we had to drive them into Katherine to put them on the train to send somewhere. Anyway, that was an interesting trip in itself, and I learned a lot from those men. But when we got close to Katherine, the manager came out in his new flash vehicle, because he was going to ride in the front of the mob, you know, as if he'd done the hard work. And so he kept a couple of the fellows, and he bushed a few of the rest of us, me included. And he gave each of the workers, the Aboriginal workers, this is prior to the equal wages case, he gave each of the workers £5, I think it was, in those days, which is a lot of money, but not a lot in terms of the work that they'd done. And he gave me the same amount. And I said, I'm not the equivalent of these experienced men who were in charge of getting this head of cattle to the railhead. And I pondered on that, and I thought, well, there's something unjust about me being given the same amount of money as these experienced workers who carried the risk and carried the burden of delivering for that particular stockman or manager of the station. So early in my life I learnt that the world isn't an equal place. You can be kicked down, but you don't have to stay down. You always find some other way to get up, find another avenue. And it's always good to have good comrades around you who can give you straight advice, not to make you feel if you're stupid, you're stupid, you know. But if you're in the right, we'll tell you it's fine. But true mates, true friends, true comrades who will help you rebuild when you have to rebuild. Otherwise you can easily succumb to so much depression, so much frustration and so much anger. And I've seen people locked up because of anger. You know, the old 3 strikes and you're in sort of caper. And until there's a treaty that settles all of these undercurrents, we won't get away from this cloud of depression that drives people down, or get away from the superiority that people think they can have a scheme like the CDP scheme, operating out in the bush and penalising people and cutting wages, cutting incomes off people for weeks, causing their kids to break into stores and then to be taken into custody by the police. You know, it's a disgraceful thing. That's why that trip down the back country was important for some of my comrades to understand this, because if there's one thing that really makes me angry is that Vincent Lingiari walked off the Victoria River station, the VRD, for the right to be his cultural boss, to develop his own enterprises, to work to get proper wages to be enjoyed and to have proper conditions and to be recognised in his own right. You know? And when I look at how much destruction there's been to First Nations people, I think, well, we have to, and the only people, well, not the only people, I mean, the Labor Party is where I am, for good or for ill. I never think the Libs are going to do it, even other people have a view about it. And I think the only people that can assist the Labor Party are the unions, because we've got to take this on board. We've got a marvellous group of people in the First Nations. We don't always see it that way, but we are standing at the point of history. We've got 3 years to work on a plan, and I've had some good discussions with the Plumbers Union and with other unions about how we might tackle some of the challenges in these remote areas. And we've got to look at, okay, let's not fight amongst ourselves about the condition. Let's get conditions and opportunities and prospects for everyone that's going to benefit other human beings in a manner that we've never known before, or they've never known before. And let's bring that revolution into these parts of the world. So whilst we worry about our concerns in our workplaces, let's really start to think through on the community development, the cultural compatibilities that we have, the synergies that we have in common for truth and justice, and to make sure that we have a workplace where we're all safe and where we progress and there's no barriers against men, women or people with other disabilities in this place. So thank you very much.